April 15th, 1532. Smithfield, London. A damp, sharp spring air clung to Smithfield, thick, with the stink of livestock, wood smoke, and rot. The cobbles sweated. Clouds sagged low, casting the market in a dull, pewter light. But no one had come to trade. They had come to watch a man die. At the square's center, an iron cauldron boiled atop stacked firewood. Flames licked its belly, churning the water into a seething froth. The air shimmered with heat. The scent of wet metal and bubbling fat curled through the crowd. Mud, sweat, and fear. Chains rattled. The condemned stepped forward. Richard Roose, a cook, once, servant in a bishop's household. Now, he would be cooked alive. They bound him in a metal gibbet, hoisted him above the pot, then, slowly, deliberately, began to lower him in. Not all at once. The steam hissed like a serpent. A scream tore loose, raw, animal, so loud it didn't sound human. The crowd flinched. Someone wept. Someone else dropped to their knees and prayed. The stench grew thick and sweet, boiled flesh. A woman vomited into her hands. A boy tried to run, but was yanked back by his father. No one could look away, not because they wanted to watch, but because something in their bones told them this was what happened to people like them. This wasn't punishment. This was a demonstration. This was theater, not justice, but spectacle. Tudor pageantry, written in fire and flesh. But who was Richard Roose? And how did a lowly kitchen hand become the centerpiece of one of the most brutal executions in English history? To understand that, we have to go back before the steam, before the screams, to a kingdom cracking beneath its own crown. Because Richard Roose didn't just fall into the fire. He was pushed by paranoia, politics, and a king reshaping the world in his own image. This is the story of the kingdom that lit the fire. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. The early 1530s were not merely a time of change. They were a revolution, sewn in velvet and steel. On the surface, England still wore the garments of medieval order. Bishops in mitres, nobles in ermine, sermons in Latin. But what looked like continuity, robes, rituals, liturgy, was camouflage. Beneath it, a regime was being rewired. At the center stood Henry VIII, restless, towering, increasingly absolute. After the blood-soaked chaos of the Wars of the Roses, he set about forging a new England, centralized, obedient, and royal to the marrow. Feudal bonds gave way to bureaucratic chains. Parliament, once a council of nobles, became an instrument of royal command. The king no longer upheld the law. He was the law, and that law could be redrawn, as often as he pleased. Enter Richard Roose. But to understand his fate, we must understand the storm that swallowed him. By 1530, Henry's obsession with a male heir had hardened into crisis. His queen, Catherine of Aragon, had failed to give him a living son. Worse, she had once been married to his dead brother Arthur. Henry, convinced God disapproved, demanded an annulment. The Pope refused. So Henry, with the razor mind of Thomas Cromwell at his side, took the crown down a darker path. Between 1532 and 1534, Cromwell shepherded a flurry of acts through Parliament that severed England from Rome. The Church of England was born, and Henry named himself its supreme head. This was not theology. It was a survival strategy, but not all bowed. Among the loudest dissenters was Bishop John Fisher, scholar, royal tutor, and moral backbone of the old order. In 1529, he had publicly defended Catherine, echoing her plaintive words, "These 20 years I've been your true wife." When Henry sought divine supremacy, Fisher resisted. In 1531, He forced the king to accept a caveat-laden title. Supreme Head, so far as the law of Christ allows. That resistance made Fisher a symbol, a thorn in the crown. He wasn't just opposing the king. He was reminding the realm that some laws stood above royal desire. And in a court driven by ambition and fear, that made him dangerous. So it's no surprise that just months later, danger found him. Not in Parliament, not in court, but in his kitchen. It began with a bowl of pottage. On a cold winter's day in 1531, at the London home of Bishop John Fisher, a simple meal turned catastrophic, igniting a national scandal and paving the way for one of the most brutal legal precedents in English history. The location, Lambeth Marsh. The victims, members of a bishop's household, and the city's poor. The accused, a kitchen hand named Richard Roose. Roose, also recorded as Rouse or cook, was no nobleman, just a servant, perhaps the cook himself, perhaps a helper, perhaps merely present at the wrong time. On February 18th, he allegedly slipped a white powder into a vessel of barm, yeast used to make pottage, a thick, savory stew served to both household guests and the hungry at the gate. Shortly after the meal was ladled out, chaos erupted. 17 people were stricken with agony, clutching their bellies, convulsing, crying out. 2 would not survive. One was Bennet Kerwin, a respected gentleman in Fisher's household. The other, Alice Trippitt, a local woman known for her weathered shawl and quiet, constant presence outside the bishop's door, where scraps were often shared with the needy. Both died in searing pain. Rose fled. He didn't get far. He was swiftly captured and locked in the Tower of London. There, under torture, he confessed, or something close to it. He claimed a stranger had handed him the powder, said it was a prank, a purgative, not a poison, just meant to cause a little looseness in the bowels. A joke, he said, but no one laughed. Who poisons an entire stew pot for fun and lets the beggars eat first? Even by Tudor standards, where medicine often blurred into superstition, the story rang hollow, and under the rack, truth and fiction often tangled until they were impossible to separate. No other suspects were found, no stranger ever named, no motive uncovered. Whether scapegoat, saboteur, or fool, Roose stood alone. When the poisoned pottage claimed 2 lives at Bishop John Fisher's residence in February 1531, panic didn't just grip Lambeth, it reached the palace. Henry VIII, already tormented by visions of betrayal and divine judgment, saw more than murder. This was treason by stealth. Poison was cowardly, invisible. It slipped past guards, bypassed armor, ignored rank. And now, it had touched the table of a royal advisor. Just 10 days later, on February the 28th, Henry stood before the House of Lords, not as a distant sovereign, but as a man personally wounded. His speech was volcanic, furious, wounded, and absolute. He called the crime not just an offense, but a stain on the soul of England, a spiritual and social rot. There was no room for argument. There would be no jury, no trial, no appeal. The king had already decided. Richard Roose would die. Rose was dragged to the Tower of London. There, shown the rack, a device that stretched limbs until they torn. He confessed, or capitulated. He admitted to adding a white powder to the yeast. He named no accomplices. He offered no motive that made sense. A prank, he said. A purgative, not a poison. But it didn't matter. By March, Parliament passed a new statute. 22 Henry VIII, Chapter 9, the Act for Poisoning. A legal weapon, forged to fit this moment. Poisoning was now high treason, and treason deserved not hanging, not beheading, not quartering, but boiling, alive. It wasn't justice, it was performance, and the law didn't just apply moving forward. It reached backward, clawing through time to ensnare Roose. There would be no escape through legal tradition. He could not plead the benefit of clergy, a common defense that once allowed even laymen to claim ecclesiastical trial. That shield was stripped away. The new statute named the Lambeth case directly. This wasn't legislation. It was retribution in legal form. The act reached backward, unearthing a new treason from an old crime, a legal sleight of hand with a body count. Under English common law, treason had long meant plotting the king's death, aiding enemies, or usurping the throne. But Henry expanded the concept. Poison, he argued, attacked something deeper, the trust between host and guest, lord and servant, king and kingdom, the sanctity of the table, and in Henry's England, even time bent to royal will. On April 5th, 1531, Richard Roose was led to Smithfield, a place long soaked in blood, now prepared for something England had never seen. Richard Roose, once a cook in Bishop John Fisher's household, was led into the square. His crime, poisoning 2 innocents. His sentence, to die, by boiling. This was not justice inherited. It was justice invented. Rose's punishment had been conjured from royal fear, then etched into statute by a parliament too frightened to refuse. The act for poisoning, passed just a year prior, redefined murder by poison as high treason, a crime that merited not the sword or the rope, but something slower, stranger, symbolic. At the square's center, a cauldron churned above a roaring fire. Its contents, variously described as water, oil, or tallow, remained disputed. Edward Hall claimed it was water. Others, like Raphael Holinshed, suggested oil for maximum cruelty. But whatever boiled inside, its purpose was unmistakable. Rose was shackled into an iron gibbet, a cage fit for no man, and hoisted above the steam. Then he was lowered, not all at once. First, the feet, then the legs, then the chest. Each descent, a sentence, each scream, a sermon. Eyewitnesses recalled the horror in agonizing detail, skin blistering and sloughing away, muscle searing from bone, limbs thrashing violently as nerve endings overloaded and failed. The crowd winced, some wept, a few turned away and vomited. Others simply stared, vacant, frozen, and disturbingly, a handful muttered that it should have been quicker, cleaner, a headsman's axe, a noose, anything but this, but that, was not the point. This was no execution. It was ritual, a grotesque pageant, a message, spoken in flame and flesh. In Tudor England, public executions were performance. They were warnings carved into bodies. And in Smithfield that day, Roose became the message. His death was not about crime. It was about control. The man who once stirred pots, now stewed in one. A grotesque symmetry. The cook had become the cuisine. There's no record of final words, no evidence of last rites or mercy draft, but such kindness would have dulled the spectacle. And here, pain was the point. Of all Tudor punishments, drawn, quartered, burned, and broken, boiling was an outlier, rare. Even the iron stomach of Henry's regime recoiled from it. Only one other case followed. Margaret Davy, a servant girl, boiled in 1542 for poisoning her mistress's household. Even for Tudor England, accustomed to gallows, flames, and blood, the punishment was too much. When Edward VI inherited the crown in 1547, one of his first acts of Parliament was to repeal the law, calling it very straight, sore, extreme, and terrible. Poisoning once again became a felony. Men were hanged. Women were burned. The cauldron was emptied. But the echo of boiling water lingered. John Fisher, the bishop whose household had been the original target, would not escape the king's wrath. He stood by Queen Catherine of Aragon. He refused to recognize Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church of England. he would not recant. For that defiance, he was arrested in 1534 and charged with treason. Appeals poured in from across Europe. The Pope made him a cardinal, too late. Henry responded coldly, "Let the Pope send him a hat. I'll send him a head to wear it." On June 22, 1535, Fisher was beheaded at the Tower of London. He met death quietly, wrapped in conviction. The Catholic Church later canonized him as a saint and martyr, and then came Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry had torn England from Rome, the queen who once carried a kingdom's future. The flame that had lit the Reformation was now just kindling for the same fire. In 1536, she was arrested and charged with adultery, incest, and treason, accusations widely believed to be fabricated. The trial was a formality, the verdict foregone. At Tower Green, beneath grey skies, a French sword severed her head with quiet precision. Anne, for whom a kingdom had been torn from God, was torn from the king with the same swiftness. In less than 5 years, Henry VIII had morphed from a Renaissance prince into a brooding autocrat. The English Reformation gave him not just religious control, but something more potent: legal absolutism. Laws like the one that killed Roose, rushed, symbolic, merciless, were no longer anomalies. They were precedents, tools, theater. Opponents were not just punished, they were made into public warnings. Even among the literate and loyal, fear grew. Some clerics whispered dissent in guarded Latin. A few humanists decried the cruelty in private letters, but most simply fell silent. Justice had become spectacle. Process had become performance. And everyone was an audience, whether they wanted to be or not. Rose's death might have seemed like an isolated horror, a grotesque aberration, but in truth, it was a signal flare. A cook had been boiled alive, a bishop beheaded, a queen undone by rumor and trial. As for Henry, he would continue. He married again, and again, and again. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, 1 survived. He dissolved monasteries, seized church lands, and ruled by fear wrapped in ceremony. By the time he died in 1547, he had reshaped not just England's religion, but its very idea of power. The man who once sought a son left behind no clear legacy, only a kingdom frayed, a crown heavier than ever, and a legal system twisted by ego and a flame. The cauldron had cooled, but the damage endured. Today, torture is condemned across the world as both inhumane and ineffective. International law prohibits it outright. Organizations like Amnesty International argue that torture doesn't yield justice. It yields fear, false confessions, and broken systems. It replaces truth with terror. This stands in sharp contrast to Tudor England, where the boiling of Richard Roose was not only legal, it was performative. A man's body became a message board. Justice became theater. Pain became policy. Roose's execution was a literalization of retributive justice, punishment designed to mirror the crime. Allegedly, he poisoned a meal, so the state made a meal of him. The cook became the cuisine. Tudor justice didn't seek reform, it sought reversal. Modern systems, at least in theory, lean toward rehabilitative or restorative justice. These models emphasize healing over harm. They ask not just what law was broken, but why, and whether restoration is possible. Practices like restorative circles or community sentencing reflect this shift in values. But the shadow of retribution never fully vanished. We see it in debates over the death penalty, solitary confinement, and the euphemisms of enhanced interrogation. We see it in televised trials, publicized executions, and spectacle politics, where justice becomes performance. Again, the tools may be different, the instinct is not. Roose's death, while rare, was symbolic. He wasn't merely punished, he was transformed into a cautionary tale, a traitor, boiled for traitorous food, a warning, simmered into public memory. But memory fades. Smithfield, once the stage for executions, is now a meat market. There's no plaque for Richard Roose, no monument, no exhibit. His screams have been buried beneath centuries of stone and soot. Others, like William Wallace, are etched in legend. Roose was forgotten. Yet the questions he leaves behind still boil beneath the surface. London forgets its blood beneath the stone. But some ghosts don't fade. Some still simmer in the cracks. And Richard Roose, cooked by law, remains one of them. If you came this far, make sure to click the next video that's on the screen right now. Subscribe to stay engaged for more content.